It is now an absolute pleasure and honor to welcome back a longtime friend of MSCI, someone who's been with us on many occasions. And our opening keynote conversation this morning is with Anya Manuel. Anya is a former diplomat, author, and expert on foreign policy. She's co-founder and partner along with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, a strategic consulting firm that helps U.S. companies navigate international markets and choppy waters from time to time. Anya is the author of the critically acclaimed book, This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States, along with numerous articles and papers. She is the director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, a premier bipartisan forum on foreign policy in the U.S. From 2005 to 2007, she served as an official at the U.S. Department of State as special assistant to the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, Nick Burns, currently ambassador to China, who was responsible for Asia policy. She began her career as an investment banker at Salomon Brothers in London, a cum laude graduate of Harvard Law and Stanford University. She's also lectured and was a research affiliate at Stanford University for nearly a decade, teaching courses on U.S. foreign policy in Asia and technology. She currently serves on two corporate boards, Ripple Labs, Inc., a leading blockchain payments company, and Overseas Shipping Group. She also serves as a member of the Defense Policy Board for the U.S. Department of Defense. Again, with the QR codes, we're going to have a conversation. We would encourage questions from the audience. So we're going to try to, I think of this session as around the world with Anya in 60 minutes as opposed to 80 days. We're going to go around the world in 60 minutes, but please, if you have questions, generate those questions coming in. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Anya Manuel. Anya? We were talking about walk-up music earlier, so...
We were rooting for Eye of the Tiger, but we got something else. Good morning, everyone.
Before we start to kind of go in the Far East and work our way back to North America, I'd like to start by focusing to get some context here on the concept of globalization. And while globalization, certainly over the last several decades, has benefited the U.S., China, and many other countries, pressures have been mounting on this globalization model. Western concerns about manufacturing have existed for years, and there has certainly been a hollowing out in the North America. But with COVID and geopolitical tensions now adding additional stresses, I wonder if you'd be so kind to share with the audience your thoughts on this globalization model. Is it nearing its end? Is it just stalled and we'll come back? But your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bob. It's always so nice to be here with you. And it still feels really nice to be with people in person. So I'm glad to see all of you here in rainy Washington, D.C. I don't think the pendulum has swung all the way back yet from globalization. You know, for years, decades, we were used to more open borders, freer movement of people, freer movement of goods. We still see the pendulum swinging back a little bit from that. Not all the way to autarky, but definitely when I talk to our CEOs that we work with at the firm, people are moving their supply chains. The watchword is resilience, not efficiency, as you all probably know. And there's a lot more regional production for that region rather than truly globalization. And I would just say, it's become pretty clear in the last 5, 6, 7 years that globalization wasn't working for everyone. And I don't have to tell you all that in this great industry, but there was a study done that always touches my heart, that in America, a white man who has a high school education or less, on average, lives 10 years less than all of us highly educated people in this room. And so it's no wonder that people were upset. And that's where you get populist movements. That's where you get America First here, and where you get Turkey first, and Erdogan, and Bolsonaro with Brazil first, and a little bit India first with Modi. So I think the reaction, the populist reaction you're seeing around the world politically is a little bit part of that problem.
So let's drill down a little bit on the supply chain disruptions, if you will. And, folks nowadays are talking about a sustainable domestic supply chain, or others would call it China plus one countries, be it plus one India, plus one Vietnam. But, your thoughts on the concept of de-risk versus decoupling from China, in particular in this post-COVID world, with now all of the geopolitical tensions that seem to be, let's just say, at a higher level than what they were several years ago.
Yeah, I like that you used the term de-risk, not decouple. I think it was actually coined by Ursula von der Leyen of the EU. I was just in Brussels a couple months ago, and I thought, oh, this is exactly what the West should be trying to do. Not stop doing business with China altogether, but be a little bit more careful. And so the supply chain movement obviously depends a lot on what industry you're on. We're seeing people not pull out of China precipitously, and I know we'll talk about what's going on inside China in a minute, but if they were gonna deploy another $1 billion or another $2 billion, they're waiting, and maybe the next factory isn't going into China, it's going into Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Mexico, and to a lesser extent, India. Those are kind of the big 4 or 5 winners, with obviously a smattering of others. And part of the reason you see that, you even see the Chinese moving their manufacturing to Vietnam, because you have lower labor costs, and you have, in the case of Vietnam, pretty good trade deals, both with the US and the West, and also with China. So you see everybody hedging their bets.
So recently, Secretary Blinken laid out President Biden's kind of foreign policy for the middle class, I think is what some have characterized it to be, that's kind of generating a little buzz. And it's, some of the components are domestic resilient supply chains, trading with like-minded countries in a critical minerals club. So your thought on the Secretary's recent comments, specifically as it relates to those components?
Yeah. I think the Biden administration is serious about this, and they're working hard on it. I mean, you heard Pete Buttigieg just repeat those words, and they mean it. Biden is a guy from a steel town, and I think he understands that people are frustrated that the industrial base here has been hollowed out. I see the Biden administration officials that I talk to being pretty clear-eyed that not all manufacturing is going to come back here. We're not going to go back to the 1960s, but a certain amount of it will. And that's why you see the CHIPS Act. That's why you see all of these big bills that have just been passed on infrastructure and on rebuilding some of our manufacturing capacity here. And you see it in pretty sober, honest talks with the Europeans. As I said, I was just in Brussels, and of course the Europeans were all up in arms about the American Inflation Reduction Act. And I sort of thought, well, you guys have been doing industrial policy like this for years, right? So I think they're working that out, and they will work it out, and that's part of the critical minerals club. Let's be clear what we need for EVs. Let's make sure we're not harming each other, but actually helping each other get those important components.
So now let's try to do around the world in 60 minutes, right? So,
here we go.
So we'll start with China, right? So numerous questions about China, but let's start with, as you reflect back upon the 2 decades ever since China was admitted to the WTO, as seen through your lens, how has that played out in reality versus intent, let's say?
Yeah. I think the intent was really positive, and I actually don't think it was a mistake at the time to try to bring them into the WTO. Now, what happened is the Chinese got better and better at cheating and not living up to their WTO obligations. The West turned a blind eye for a really long time. But overall, those decades were peaceful. There was an enormous amount of economic growth and an enormous bringing people out of poverty, especially in China. Let me say a little bit about what's going on inside China right now. when you just saw that Xi Jinping has re-elected himself for a third and maybe forever term. A little kerfuffle yesterday when I guess Biden at a private event called him a dictator. The man is a dictator, so that is true. Maybe it's not a polite thing to call somebody, but he absolutely is. And we would say what we see in China is it moving from an authoritarian state to something that looks more totalitarian. So you have to think about it as every time there's a choice between economic growth and politics, politics is going to trump. What Xi Jinping wants most of all is to ensure that the Communist Party of China can rule for another century. And if you see everything through that lens, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes our clients say to us, but I don't understand, this didn't make sense for the economy. Why is he doing this? He's had to turn tail a little bit because even dictators have a public. And those protests last fall about the COVID restrictions were really extreme. And a lot of you probably do business in China, the COVID restrictions in China were unlike anything we saw here. We all thought we were locked into our houses. In China, you would have these traffic circles with 10 lanes that would have 1,000 cars a minute normally empty. People literally locked into their apartment buildings, not able to go even get groceries unless they got special permission. So understandably, people were frustrated. That's the politics. Politics trumps everything. There's less and less space in China for open expression. I used to go to China 4 or 6 times a year. Even the last time I was there, before COVID started, 2 of my friends, who I would normally go to their house, said, oh, Anya, we're glad you're here, but let's go for a walk and please don't bring your cell phone. So it's no longer comfortable for Chinese to be friendly with Americans, especially Americans that used to work in the US government. On the economy, it's a really mixed bag. I get a sense that here, the news always wants to report the negative that's going on in China. You know, the property collapse, all of that is real. There's been a push coming, a lot of consumer boom coming out of COVID, but that's petering out a little bit. I haven't been back in China. I'm supposed to go in a month, but the reports I hear from people who've recently been on the ground is it's going really well, and we're a little bit wrong in our perception. So things are growing fast, innovation is happening, the tech companies are up and running, and we can't just count on them, collapsing of their own weight. So that's economics. On the military side, it's a very difficult situation. You saw Blinken just being in China, and what did he ask for? A return to normal military-to-military communications. That sounds really pretty esoteric, but it's not. It's really important. We now have so many planes jostling around. The Chinese are constantly testing Taiwanese air defenses, ships floating around in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, and the East China Sea. Just a week and a half ago, a Chinese ship cut off an American military ship at 100 yards. That's nothing when you're going at full speed. So the worry that the US military has, understandably, is that you're going to have an accident and no one will know who should call whom to resolve the crisis. You saw this with the spy balloon. This should have been a small hiccup. Everybody spies on each other. It was clearly a spy balloon. It wasn't a weather balloon. But it should have been resolvable, and because they won't talk to us, it makes it harder to resolve, and it makes it more frightening. Have I depressed you yet?
Yeah, all right. Somehow I think it's only going to get more depressing as we work our way around the world.
Russia yet.
But so, we talk a lot about leadership in the context of business leadership. We also, through some of our programs at Thayer, we learn a lot from the military in the U.S. to try to apply to business leadership. So given the work that you've done in China, when you look at Premier Xi, and you compare and contrast with Deng Xiaoping, or even going back to Mao, while they're all communist, is there anything that distinguishes Xi's personality or his leadership style that's different from some of these other, very important and very famous, very powerful Chinese leaders, let's say, post-World War II?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question. So Mao, of course, the complete dictator until the late 1970s. Then you have Deng Xiaoping. You have a couple of other more moderate Chinese leaders. And they innovate in the early 1980s, and they create, instead of having one all-powerful leader, they really make decisions by committee. And that's the standing committee. It used to be 9 men, now it's 7 men, and it's always all men. And it works pretty well. And so when you say, gosh, how naive was the West opening up to China and getting them into the WTO, if your assumption is that you're going to have Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping, like Hu Jintao, that would have been okay. But then you get Xi Jinping come into power. And he owns all of the strings of power. When you see how the Chinese system works internally, they have these things called special leading groups. So there's one on the economy, there's one on foreign policy. He runs all of them. He wants to be totally in control. And the problem there is the US doesn't think he's always getting the full truth. Like, he really was lied to by his people about the spy balloon, for example. People are afraid to tell him when things are going wrong, and that's when you start having problems. When I teach this at Stanford, I say autocracies like this are like glass. They're really rigid. You tap them 100 times, nothing happens. Tap it just the right way, and it shatters. I'm not saying that there's going to be a Tiananmen Square type uprising or that Xi Jinping is going to fall from power, but it's really opaque. And the tighter he holds on, the more pressures there are in the system. So it's a difficult thing, and I feel for all of you running companies that are probably doing business with China or in China or you have operations there. It just makes it, at its heart, incredibly unpredictable.
So one last question on China, then we'll start to move around the world. But as you look through your crystal ball, there's a bunch of different scenarios that could play out relative to Taiwan.
Yeah.
So again, if you would, for the audience, through your crystal ball, what are some of those scenarios? What is the likelihood of some of those scenarios? And, for every action, there's a reaction, right?
Yeah.
And there are intended and unintended consequences. So your thoughts on Taiwan?
Absolutely. The problem is, of course, no one has a crystal ball, which is what makes this so worrying. Taiwan, of course, is a democracy. The agreement that the world has made about Taiwan is that they won't seek full independence and China won't seek to swallow it up again. That's kind of fundamentally what they're all arguing about. Xi Jinping, in contrast to his predecessors, says in every speech there's going to be reunification with Taiwan, peaceful if possible, but if not, then not. So that has everyone really, really scared. What do we see? A full Beijing invasion of Taiwan, I think our government assesses as relatively unlikely because Xi Jinping isn't like Putin. It's just a different kind of leader. Also, that kind of invasion is harder than D-Day. It's really hard militarily to do that. So what's more likely? More likely is something that looks a little bit more how the mainland of China swallowed Hong Kong. Or beyond that. When Nancy Pelosi went on her visit last August, what did the Chinese military exercise? A blockade. So for a week, planes couldn't really go in and out, ships couldn't come in and out. We had clients call us saying, gosh, we can't land our planes in Taipei. This is a really powerful tool by the Chinese because America's not going to go to war over a military exercise. That would be outrageous. But as you all know, because you're business leaders, what happens if they do that over and over and over again? Maybe your supply chain goes somewhere else. Maybe your flight hub isn't Taipei, but maybe next time it's Seoul. So that's a way to strangle it. The Beijing could mess in the election that's coming up in Taiwan in less than a year, put their finger on the scale for one candidate. There could be cyber attacks. There could be all sorts of more moderate things that get tougher and tougher and tougher until the frog is boiled.
So now let's segue to
happy country.
Mr. Putin and Russia, right? So clearly what Putin's initial expectations of that conflict were going to be have not played out that way. And we are now moving well into year 2 of this conflict. But before we get into specifically the conflict, obviously I know that you're very familiar with Putin as an individual, as the leader of Russia. So again, for the audience, kind of shape the character of the man and how that may define the actions that he initially took and continues to take relative to the conflict.
Thank you. That's such a great and important question. So I have never met Vladimir Putin, luckily. But Condi Rice, my business partner, who obviously used to have to spend a lot of time with him, would say, this is a great power acting badly. And here is how. Putin is a Russian nationalist. So he's not trying to rebuild the entire Soviet Union, but he is trying to rebuild Mother Russia, and he's been saying that since he was mayor of St. Petersburg. And what does that mean? What's Mother Russia? It's Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So Belarus, he's basically absorbed. Ukraine, they're working on. And Condi tells this interesting story. She said she was talking to Putin once, and he said, you know, Condi, you know us Russians, and Russia is only great when it's run by great men. Peter the Great, Tsar Alexander. And then he stops, and Condi thinks, oh, and you mean Vladimir Putin the Great. So that's how you have to think about this. There's all of this, oh, it was the West and NATO expansion. And no, this man is a Russian nationalist who wants to reunify great Mother Russia, come what may. And that makes him really, really hard to defeat because everything, this isn't a war about a legitimate grievance that can be addressed. This is an all-out war that he thinks he is not able to lose.
So if you follow that line of reasoning, there is no off-ramp for him to save face.
Yeah, and that's a little bit the problem. So when we look, I really hope we're wrong about this because I've now absolutely depressed everyone in the room. But when we look at this conflict and how it's playing out, let's hope the Ukrainians do well in this counteroffensive that's now started. They have certainly been unbelievably courageous. But the more likely trajectory you have here is a really long slog until both sides have exhausted themselves, and then a peace settlement that looks pretty ugly. So it's, you're right, there's no real off-ramp for him, which is the problem. And by the way, what's waiting in the wings behind Vladimir Putin, like let's say, you know, last year there was all this hope that people would rise up and he would be deposed. He's put all that down. There's no real, we spoke recently to a very smart, thoughtful Russian woman who's a senior executive at a Western firm, just to hear what's going on inside Russia. And she said, most people don't watch the Western news. It's only a few people like me, you know, who work for American companies. So they believe the stuff he's telling them, that it was America's fault, basically. And Russians are used to suffering. We're used to inflation. We're used to not having enough food around. So the Russians can hold out for a really long time. And by the way, they have 3 times as many people as the Ukrainians.
So one last question, again, from a leadership standpoint and from a political infrastructure standpoint. So if you just compare Gorbachev's rise to power and Putin's rise to power, same country, different times, different backgrounds, but how can you have such 2 diametrically opposite, you know, Russian communists ascend to the throne, so to speak? What transpired from the Gorbachev Communist Party, the Gorbachev, you know, rise to power with the Politburo versus Putin's?
Yeah, it's true. I guess in politics, timing is everything. So Gorbachev came to power when the old model, and they were really old men, old dictators, had exhausted themselves. The Russian economy was on its knees in the early 1980s. And so they took a leap of faith on a young, new, different leader who, by the way, went way farther than anybody else in the Soviet Union wanted. And Gorbachev is revered in the West, but he's reviled in Russia. And so what do you have? You have Gorbachev ends the Soviet Union. Then you have Yeltsin. He's an alcoholic. He's a little bit pro-Western, but basically the Russian economy completely tanks, and people don't have anything. They don't have food. They don't, we were talking about globalization before. And that gives rise to a strongman like Vladimir Putin, who also, by the way, did another really smart thing. He guaranteed that if Yeltsin left power, that he and his family and his cronies wouldn't be prosecuted for corruption. The problem now is no one can make that guarantee to Vladimir Putin. So timing is everything.
Yeah. So in the city, obviously this week, moving now to India, Prime Minister Modi is here, and India is now the world's largest country. It's surpassed China, and your thoughts on Modi, his leadership style, India today, but more importantly, India over the next, say, 3 to 5 years, how that may evolve from an economic standpoint, a political standpoint, supply chain standpoint. It just seems to me that, in theory, the world's largest democracy, right? A lot of folks in this room have ties to India, either directly or indirectly, but your thoughts on India today and how you see it unfolding over the next couple of years.
Great. Finally, we're on a more optimistic country.
Yeah.
It's great. So I'm sure you all saw the cheering and the dancing outside yesterday. It was very sweet. Lots of Indian Americans welcoming Modi to town. He always gets kind of a rock star hero's welcome. And Modi has been a very good leader for the Indian economy. India is a hard country to run. It is a democracy. So it's the opposite of what I said about China. Rigid, opaque. You can build airports pretty quickly if you're an autocrat like the Chinese. That's a lot harder in a democracy where you have to ask, where can I build it? And the farmers have an opinion, and everybody else has an opinion. So when you get frustrated doing business in India and how slow it is, there's also a benefit in that, which is because it's a democracy, it's more resilient. If it may be slow, but if it's not working, they throw the bums out. But that also means that Modi's economic reforms aren't going to be all that fast. He's done one really, really important positive thing, and that is fix the tax rates between different states in India. It's called the GST. You used to have in India trucks waiting days and days to go from one Indian state to another because they had to pay the tariffs. It was ridiculous, totally inefficient. So he's fixed that. He's really made a big push on infrastructure. It's not perfect, as you all know, if you've been to see your operations in India, if you have operations in India. So I would say I'm a big Indophile. I'm optimistic about India in the long run, but it's always going to disappoint a little bit. And you see this in the hopeful pronouncements. Foxconn, which maker of the iPhone, says, pretty soon we're going to manufacture 25% of iPhones in India. Okay. Well, 2 years later, they're making 5 to 7%. So it's just going to always take a little longer than we think. And I would say I have to say one thing. India is a close friend of the United States, and that's very important. And that's why you see this pomp and circumstance with the state visit playing out right outside the door today. But the hard right part of the BJP, which is Prime Minister Modi's party, is pretty extreme, to the point where you have had a lot of NGOs shut down. You have whenever I say something like this, even sort of mildly critical, as a friend of India, I get Twitter trolls saying, how dare she criticize us? And there's a little bit less space. Not that India is going to become an autocracy. They're not going to become like China. But this is a real populist BJP with a strong grip on power that doesn't want to hear anything counter to its own philosophy. And that worries me a little bit. And as friends, we should talk about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One last question in India, then we got some questions from the audience. I'm going to go back to China in a minute, but one last question on India. In terms of the infrastructure, there was this horrific tragedy, obviously, with the rail crash recently. Sort of your assessment of just the infrastructure of the, as it relates to the domestic economy, as it relates to industrial production in China. How do you see that playing out over the next couple of years?
Yeah, you all have probably lived it. I'm sure many of you are doing business in India. it's just going to be slow and painful. You know, when you go to China, every road is gleaming, every airport is perfect. You think, gosh, what are we doing here in the United States? In India, they're trying. There's another $1.4 trillion infrastructure package, but it just gets built slowly, and sometimes it doesn't make any sense. A couple of years ago, I was in an Indian city, and the airport was new and gleaming. The ring road was good, but there was no connector road between the airport and the city. And you're like, really? Isn't that the first thing you build, right? So that's just going to keep happening, unfortunately. And the train wreck in particular, those trains are really, really old. A lot of the train tracks date from even before India got its independence. So that's why you're seeing some of those tragedies.
So a lot of folks in this room are tied to automotive. So we're going to freeze frame the travel around the world and now talk about, you know, a very important industry, automotive, to folks in this room. So, you know, historically, when the West hasn't necessarily had enough raw materials, it's turned to China over the last 20 years in particular. Your thoughts in this race toward the electrification of vehicles, right, and battery capacity in particular. How do you see, you know, China emerging as it relates to providing the necessary raw materials for this movement in Europe in particular, but as well as in North America as we migrate to more and more electrification of vehicles?
Yeah, I'd actually love to hear from you all on this because you see it up close. In a geopolitical context, I see China not directly supplying so many of the raw materials, but doing a very, very good job locking them up where they exist, in Papua New Guinea, in Indonesia, all across Africa. You know, the West just didn't pay a lot of attention. You know, when did you hear the word critical minerals 3 years ago? Maybe you all did, but certainly in geopolitics you didn't. So this push that the Biden administration is doing, and I think this is really bipartisan, to think where is this coming from and how do we do it and how do we do it better, is really important. There's a gentleman who, I just won't name it, but he's on the board of Ford. And he tells a story where he was in Indonesia recently because they're trying to get nickel for their EVs. And not only the nickel mine and the reprocessing plant, but the entire town and the school and the theater and the roads, everything is run by China. So they're ahead in the game. We got to catch up.
Blockchain, right? So, you know, what kind of role do you see blockchain playing in the metals industry, the steel industry, right? I mean, are we on the cusp of a whole transformation of the economic model of the steel industry with blockchain? Your thoughts, please.
Oh, that's very interesting. So the board I sit on is a blockchain company that does international payments, way faster, better, swift, because payments inside the US are good. I don't know how often you guys have to send things to the developing world, but wires get lost. I don't know why it's so hard in 2023. I haven't thought about blockchain in the steel industry in particular. I do think this is a really important technology because what it does at its heart, it says X is X, and it seals that with cryptography. So that means if you have title insurance for your land, for example, you don't have to dig through records and pieces of paper. It's like the blockchain says that this land belongs to Bob, and so it belongs to Bob. Hugely helpful in the developing world. You can imagine if you have really sensitive supply chains, like what goes into the Defense Department, making sure that each component, whether it's steel or anything else that goes through this, has been earmarked, and it says this component comes from where we say it does. And it's stamped with a blockchain, and then it's immutable. That's kind of the point of blockchain. It's gotten really caught up in the American imagination, in particular with cryptocurrency. Those two things don't need to go together. And I would say just here, the US government across the last couple of administrations, and it's not partisan, across all three recent administrations, has not done a good job here. We should have regulated this industry up front, had real clear guardrails, said, look, you have to know your customer, you have to do anti-money laundering, you can't be doing fraud and tax evasion, and then go, innovate within those guidelines. And we didn't do that. So the US has let 1,000 fraudulent flowers bloom, And in my perspective, I obviously have a clear perspective. Companies that have been really trying to be responsible, like Ripple, where I serve on the board, Coinbase, a couple of others, have been sued by the SEC. So it's a perfect example of regulation gone wrong. I'm sure you guys see that in your industry.
So now coming back to around the world in 60 minutes, the Middle East. So your thoughts and reflections on the Middle East today and how things are apt to evolve as it relates to U.S.-Israel relations, Saudi Arabia, Iran, within those countries. Again, your thoughts and kind of framing that part of the world for us.
Yeah, this is still a dangerous part of the world, but I think there's some real glimmers of hope here too. So the way I try to understand the Middle East is whenever you see straight borders in geopolitics, something probably went wrong. And in the Middle East, the French and the British after World War I, Sykes and Picot, drew these really arbitrary lines that crossed Shia, Sunni religions. They crossed tribes. And so what you've seen for the past 2 decades really is kind of the unraveling of that and a new Middle East emerging. And so if you're not paying close attention, that's a little bit what the war in Iraq was ultimately about, Syria, what's going on in Yemen. It's all a version of this Shia-Sunni conflict and people kind of trying to come to terms with it. That's the dark side. Iran is still a real problem. They are very close to having enough fissile material for a bomb. It's pretty much unstoppable, I would say. I wouldn't say that on TV, but it's a very hard situation. And they're doing lots of other bad things. They're meddling in Syria and Lebanon, and they fund terrorists, and they do all sorts of bad things. Okay, that's the dark part. On the positive side, I go to the Middle East probably 2 times a year, and people don't want to talk about that. People just want to get on with it. And they want to move away from the oil economy, and they have a big youth bulge, and the youth wants to be entrepreneurs and tech entrepreneurs and go to normal restaurants and just have a normal life. I just saw a survey yesterday of Arab youth, and 90% want to be more like the United Arab Emirates, Dubai. Dubai is a lot like Miami, right? So you have this kind of glimmer of hope in that, and that's where the Abraham Accords came from, that were initially between Israel and Bahrain, which is a very forward-leaning, great little country, and the Emirates. Morocco joined, and now I just heard on the news in the middle of the night last night that there might be some inklings that even Saudi Arabia might come around to this. So all of that traditional Middle East, oh, everyone's against the Israelis, and oh, the poor Palestinians, we're sort of ignoring the Palestinians now, and people just want to do business together. And the Abraham Accords are real. I can't tell you the number of phone calls I got when they first came through saying, hey, you know a lot of people in the Middle East. I'm an Israeli venture capitalist. Who can I invest in Bahrain or in Abu Dhabi? It's pretty great. So I think the Middle East is a region that the Western news media doesn't portray very accurately.
Any thoughts on the LIV PGA merger, the golf merger, as long as we're talking about Saudi Arabia
no
here?
thoughts on that.
Oh, okay,
Absolutely
okay. So that you have to ask your partner, Secretary Rice, because being the great golfer that she is, I would love to hear her thoughts on that. So
that's right.
So let's now kind of segue to Europe, right? And the EU and the UK, and there's been some change in leadership there, but there's been, kind of a transformation from their heavy dependence on Russia for oil to, with the war in Ukraine. They've kind of quickly, kind of pivoted to that. But, your thoughts and reflections on the Middle East today and what you see unfolding there, especially in terms of opportunities for either folks in this room or customers of folks in this room.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine took a lot of people by surprise. It was a horrible thing to have happen, but 3 positive things came out of it, and I think they're underreported. 1, US business and government really worked hand in hand. I mean, I saw this in the week or so after the invasion, how many of the CEOs that we work with did exactly the right thing. They went way beyond what the sanctions required. They sometimes shut down their operations in Russia, sometimes not, helped their Russian employees, helped their Ukrainian employees, delivered humanitarian aid. It was amazing. Like, business really stepped up. I'm getting to Europe. In the United States, Republicans and Democrats worked together on this. Look, there's crazy outliers at the wings of either party saying, oh, we shouldn't support Ukraine, but by and large, this is a just and honorable fight, and as long as we're not fighting and dying, we should be giving them all the tools they have to succeed. And this is what gets me to Europe. Europe and the United States have been working more closely together than I've ever seen. It's amazing how quickly we put together a really tough sanctions regime. Sanctions can only go so far. You can see it eroding now. But boy, we try to cut the world's 7th largest economy out of the world economy. That's a really hard thing to do. And they did a lot of good things on export control. And the Europeans have to be commended in how quickly they turned away from Russian oil and gas. That was really hard and not a given. And how much more muscular their foreign policy and their defense policy has become. So that's all good. Now comes the hard part. We talked about how this is going to be a hard slog. Look, you can make it for a year on emergency rations. I'm sure many of you work with factories. I'm German, so I spend a lot of time in Germany. And I know anecdotally factories that used to run 3 shifts, now they can only run 1. You can do that for a while. Can you do that forever? The European economy has been hit pretty hard by the inflation from this war and by a slowdown. And so that's going to weigh on it a little bit, but I think you're seeing a steady state. So probably not much worse, but it is absolutely weighing on European economic growth.
Any update on Brexit? I mean, there's not much being written about it or said about it. You don't hear much about it. I mean, is it just sort of fade to black? Or, I mean, what is going on as it relates to the UK economically and its ties going forward with Europe?
Yeah, I have a strong view here that not everyone shares, but this was an enormous mistake, Brexit. And you see it. I was in London in May, and London is super wealthy still. But Britain is small again. And you can see that. You can see the kind of the wheels coming off a little bit. Like, while London is still fancy, where are the next jobs going for the great European American financial institutions? They're not going to London. They're going to Paris and Barcelona, and they're going to kind of everywhere else. And so people aren't precipitously leaving England, but England has become a smaller country. And once you get farther afield from London, it looks pretty bad. It looks a little like our hollowed out industrial cities that are having problems. And I think that they've just made it harder for themselves by not allowing themselves to trade freely with with their biggest trading partner. And it's hard. I do commend Rishi Sunak. I know is an unpopular leader because he's not a very good politician. But he's sort of a technocrat who's trying really hard to do the right things. I just wonder if they'll allow him to stay in power long enough to actually make some of those important changes.
Now let's move down to Africa. So this past March, our son got married in South Africa, and I was struck by the power in Cape Town area.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
But I was struck by the power shortages. You don't hear much about that here, but they call this load shedding for 4 times a day, 2 hours each time, no electricity, right? So whether you're in a restaurant or whether you're drying your hair or whatever, all of a sudden, within that 2-hour block, there's no power. And then doing some further research just in South Africa, but my question is broader to the whole continent. Like 50 to 60 of their power plants are 70 or 80 years old.
Right.
80-some% are coal-fired, and they have a severe power issue. They also seem to be coming down on the wrong side of history. You see several Russian oligarchs' yachts in Cape Town Harbor. The largest manganese mine in the country is owned by one of Putin's oligarchs, and they've recently been visiting him. And so there's, when I was there, folks were saying that, well, the Chinese, as part of their Belt and Road strategy, are going to come in, and the Chinese will solve all these energy problems, but we all know what that means. You'll be selling your soul, if you will. So your thoughts, whether starting with South Africa, but really your broader thoughts about Africa and its future, especially given the ties with Putin and the ties with China versus the West. How is that really going to shake out?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was in Africa right before Christmas, and I see it's sort of a split screen. On the one hand, you see infrastructure that still isn't there, power outages, shortage of water now with climate change, and South Africa is the most developed of the countries, but you see that across the continent. And then understandably, it's very tempting to have the Chinese come in and say, yeah, we'll pave it, we'll do it. Now, the Belt and Road isn't just one solid juggernaut. You see people bending back from that a little bit and going back and forth. You've seen this in South Africa, where the previous administration was really all in on China, all in on the Belt and Road, probably getting paid off by the Chinese. And then they voted those guys out, and the new government hasn't quite gotten its act together, but it's not totally in the pocket of China. So you see this kind of swinging back and forth. So that's one side. And definitely the really important part here with what China and Russia are doing in Africa, they're locking up what we talked about, critical minerals, all sorts of raw materials. And the information space, they just own. The West has been really slow to get it. I couldn't understand why I kept hearing Chinese talking points when I was there. I was in 3 different countries, and I was like, are you kidding me? And then someone told me, oh yeah, Xinhua, which is the Chinese propaganda machine, it's like their Associated Press, but run by the Chinese Communist Party, gives their services for free to every reputable paper and TV station and radio station in Africa and Latin America. We don't do that. We probably should. You know, they would happily use the Associated Press or Reuters if we were giving it to them, but it's free, so they report what Xinhua says. So you hear a lot of like, well, the inflation we have here is America's fault because of America's war on Russia. You're like, what planet are you living on, right? So that's one side of the split screen. The other side of the split screen is, especially in the cities, again, just like the Middle East, our newspapers aren't giving us here the full story. I met with a bunch of young tech entrepreneurs, filmmakers, people trying to make it work. We were in Rwanda. Rwanda is a beautiful country that's completely rebuilt itself since the genocide, doing a lot of the right things on the environment. So you have kind of both things happening at once. But I'm sure you all are seeing it personally because you're probably there.
Right. So now crossing the Atlantic, let's go north of the U.S., Canada. A lot of folks in this room have operations in Canada. We also have some Canadian domiciled companies in this room as it relates to the Canadian economy, the East and the West, U.S.-Canadian relations. So how would you paint that picture for folks in this room who really do a lot of business back and forth across our northern border?
Yeah, you all know it better than I do, but we are very lucky to have Canada as our northern neighbor. Like, how lucky is this country to have 2 neighbors where there are no concerns about borders? It's assumed that there's going to be peace. With USMCA, there's a trade deal that, I mean, you guys can tell me the details, but that seems to be working really pretty well. And we're friends with each other. You know, sometimes with Canada, you have, you know, softwood lumber. You have kind of the tyranny of petty differences, especially around trade. But by and large, this is a great relationship. And we're very lucky, and as businesses, you're lucky that it's easy and that you can trade easily back and forth. My other business partner, Steve Hadley, tells the story that right after 9/11, they were obviously working in the White House, and as you all know, they shut down the borders because they had to. Everything was terrified. Within 3 days, no one in America could build a car. You all know that. That's not news to you. But that's how open these borders are, and I think that's helped all of us.
So I remember a couple of years ago, General Mike Hayden was on stage, and he talked about then, so this goes back about a decade or so, that one of the greatest threats to the U.S. Was really on our southern border, right? So again, now sort of turning your attention to our relations with Mexico, from a business standpoint, economic standpoint, but also from a geopolitical standpoint with this administration as it relates to specifically trade and movement of product across our southern border.
Yeah. So people were very worried when AMLO first got elected because there was a chance that he could have been a super populist leader like what you've seen with the Kirchners in Argentina. You know, it hasn't worked out that way. And the companies I work with that are doing a lot of business in Mexico are pretty positive on it. You know, you've got some things like the airport, probably that needed to be restructured. But people were really worried that there were going to be expropriations, that it was going to do a lot of really stupid things for the Mexican economy, and he hasn't. And as you probably see intimately, you know, the Mexican economy is humming. So when we talk about the immigration crisis and who's coming across the border, it's not Mexicans. It's people from Guatemala, El Salvador, where things are really unsafe and dangerous by and large. It's not Mexicans fleeing to the U.S.
So back to another question from the audience. Go back to India for a second.
It's hard to see you all. If you want to raise your hand, we're happy to take more questions.
The question from the audience is, will the Hindu nationalism of the Modi government, especially if the extreme nationalists within the government, eventually catch up with them and lead to a regression in terms of India's economic growth and development?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I don't know. It hasn't done that yet. You know, the BJP has been this political juggernaut. Look, they lose some elections too. But it hasn't impacted economic growth. In fact, India is one of the fastest growing large economy, growing at 7% a year. We can only dream of that. So it hasn't done that yet. At what point does it flip and become hard? Like you see this in Turkey with Erdogan, where at first it was like, hey, he's a strong man and he's really tough, but at least he's doing the right things. And then hyperinflation and the complete disaster that you now see in Turkey. My guess, but it's only an educated guess, is that the BJP economics would trump politics. And if it were a choice, they'd make the choice for growth. You see this over and over again. You see it with their domestic policies, but you also see it, for example, with things that we don't like so much, like the Indians have not condemned Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, and they are benefiting mightily from the cheap oil they're getting. And when we call them on that, they say, do you see how poor this country is? We need everything we can do to grow. And so we're going to keep buying that cheap oil. So I think the BJP economics will be the driver.
Another question from the audience. Do you think that China's restraint in their support of Russia's war in Ukraine is a result of their economic ties with the West? Because that's part
Russia's
of
restraint on Taiwan.
that they have not more visibly and openly supported Putin. I mean, they've done their dance, but it's been a little more passive. They're kind of sitting on the sidelines as opposed to actively, supporting Putin.
Oh, good
Is
point.
that being heavily influenced by their ties to the West?
It is. This is such a good point, and we haven't addressed it yet. So people talk about this new China-Russia axis, famously. Right before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he was in Beijing for the Olympics, and they declared their no limits, forever friendship. And I think Putin didn't tell Xi Jinping the full truth. I think Xi Jinping was a little surprised by how brutal and extreme this invasion was, and a little taken aback. And you see that in the Chinese statements where they say the right thing and they're positive towards Russia, but they haven't gone all the way. Also, by the way, it's public news, but the American government read the Chinese the Riot Act and said, if you supply arms to Russia and Ukraine, we are coming after you, not just with sanctions, but with secondary sanctions. And that has almost held. Now, it doesn't hold on the kind of dual use stuff like chips, semiconductor exports from China to Russia are up like 21x. Things like aluminum oxide, which you all would know, but goes into body armor and things, exports way up. Heavy trucks, exports way up. So all of that kind of stuff you're seeing. Just recently, in the last couple of weeks, you've seen a creeping of China sending more stuff to Russia more directly. but they're trying to hold the line because they're worried, because they care a lot more about doing business with us and with Europe than they do about doing business with the small Russian economy.
So, not a political question, but climate change. So clearly this administration, and we heard a couple of representatives of the administration talk last night at our dinner, climate change and a journey toward reducing carbon footprint is very, very important to the administration. The rest of the world doesn't necessarily play by the same rules or embrace the same passion to lower carbon footprint. So your thoughts as it relates to trade, in particular in the industrial sector for us, carbon footprint, as the U.S. steel industry continues to lower its carbon footprint, and, I would say we are on the cutting edge in the world of reducing carbon footprint. China is not necessarily, right? Nor are some other non-market economies. But how would you advise the administration to keep that in perspective while trying to reduce carbon footprint here, but not doing so that puts any folks in this room at a competitive disadvantage with, in particular, some non-market economies who don't have that same passion as it relates to the climate? Thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. And it is interesting how much just in the last 5 years I've seen the switch in boardrooms and with CEOs on climate. From, hey, let's just ignore this, a lot of people, to this is serious, we're going to do our part. We were chatting earlier over coffee about steel mills putting in net zero plans. I really like that movie that Nucor just showed us. I serve on an energy transportation company board. We have a net zero plan, and it's real, and we're getting there, and it's ambitious but doable. It's sort of the rational policy rather than the hype and the politicians announcing it. This is a real problem that, in China and in elsewhere, you don't have the same rules. And so the Europeans, as you know, take a really tough line on this, and they're talking about the carbon import tax. That's going to be really complicated to administer and to measure. But ultimately, that general direction is one we're going to have to go in, because you can't handicap all of our businesses and the European businesses trying to do the right thing and then undercut it with things that are not doing the right thing for the climate elsewhere.
So
Very hard.
Through the lens of our allies, as well as other countries around the world that may not be allies, how do they view the political toxicity that exists here today in our political system, where extremes of both parties have, tried to pull both parties to extremes, and whether it's playing out on TV or whatever, politics it's always been a combat sport, but politics in the last 4, 5, 6 years, one might say, has sort of fallen off the ledge, right?
Exactly.
So how do our allies, how does our Western allies in Europe, or even, Putin or China or India, how do they really view what's going on here inside of our political system as it relates to the calculus of any of their actions that they are thinking through, whether it be economic actions, immigration actions, military actions? How do they view what's kind of going on here, given what's happened with our political system?
Yeah, it's not doing us any favors. We're not doing ourselves any favors. So I'll give you two quick vignettes. When I was in Europe recently, in London and in Paris, I was giving talks like this, but to European audiences. Every second question was, is Trump going to get reelected? Is Trump going to get reelected? The Europeans feel very comfortable with the Biden administration. I don't know what the politics are in this room, but it works for Europe. It's an animal they understand. It's predictable. It's pretty similar to them. They've become much more transatlanticist, partly because it's softer coming from Biden. Trump said some of the right things, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't buy that stuff from Huawei. But he said it with such force that the Europeans didn't want to hear it. And you have a really close relationship with our friends and allies now. That is going to be much harder if you have a President Trump, just because he's so much more unpredictable and his administration was very unpredictable. Our competitors, I'll give you the second story. I spent last week talking to a lot of friends, former colleagues inside China to hear how things are going. The Chinese newspapers are constantly filled with glee about how dysfunctional we are. Every story that's dysfunctional is played up. Look, they can't get anything done. Look, this is a power that's on the wane. Look, this is Rome right before the end. They can't get anything together. They can't agree on anything. You hear that over and over and over again. And so this story of American demise, we can only push back on if we, in my view, get our act together and try to govern from somewhere in the common sense middle.
Mm-hmm. So immigration policy, another question from the audience.
And that's the common sense middle right there.
I mean, really, the number one challenge for everybody in this room is talent, right? Acquiring it and keeping it and developing it and mentoring it. And so my question is, why is it so difficult politically
I don't know.
to really get a workable immigration policy? It doesn't matter under Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, one party controlling all three, chambers or split government. Why, again, your thoughts on why we can't get this done?
It's unbelievable, right? We're off the record here, but the kind of imbecilic behavior, the Florida shipping immigrants to Gavin Newsom and to say this, and I live in California, we're not really doing it all right either. But you just think there are policy solutions here that will work and that are a compromise. And every time we get close, I was a young State Department staffer when George W. Bush got this close with Teddy Kennedy on real comprehensive immigration reform. That was just thoughtful and was not everyone was getting everything they wanted, but everyone was getting a little bit. That's kind of the point of democracy, and I have no idea why we can't do it now. But
so you've had an incredible career, primarily in foreign policy. When you look back at, let's just say, post-World War II, right? Who do you think, from a foreign policy standpoint, in terms of what they accomplished while in office, who do you revere as potentially, post-World War II, the most effective U.S. president as it relates to foreign policy? Keep domestic policy aside.
That's so interesting. I haven't given that a lot of thought, but I have a pretty clear answer. I think it's the combination of Truman and Eisenhower. If we talk about the stuff we're arguing now, do you know what they did? You stood up NATO. You stood up the United Nations. You came out of the shambles of World War II, and you said, we're going to do the Marshall Plan, and we're going to rebuild Germany, our biggest enemy. I'm a beneficiary of that. I grew up in Germany in the 70s and 80s. Wouldn't have happened the other way. We were magnanimous, we were thoughtful, we were smart, and we did big things. And then Eisenhower doubled down on what Truman did, and all of the stuff we're arguing about now, I spent yesterday morning and then today on the Hill talking to some members of Congress behind the scenes about things like the CHIPS and Science Act and high-tech immigration, and how are we going to educate our students for what's to come? How are we going to train our students? Eisenhower put together an education act that was $1 billion at the time. Bob Gates always says this. He studied Russian under that act. A lot of people studied engineering. Why can't we do something like that now? We seem sort of hamstrung by our own politics, and it's frustrating.
Right.
And by the way, there's an urgency here. This isn't sort of the 80s and 90s when everything was going along pretty well. This is pretty dangerous, and we have a real competitor and a real race to run. So to the extent that you all are engaged in politics and can encourage your members of Congress and others to just legislate already and compromise sometimes, I think we would do our country a favor.
Well, speaking of doing our country a favor, I know I speak for everybody in this room. We all thank you and all of your partners for the service that you've all given to this country. One can make a strong case that we are a better country today because of you, Secretary Rice, Mr. Hadley, and Gates, for the service, the work that you did for our country. So please, in addition to thanking you for being with us today, please take that heartfelt thanks back to all your partners for their service to our country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Anya Manuel.
Thank you.